All right, well, we'll get started, and I'll do a quick introduction to myself and the session, and then we'll get into the talks. This session is focused on enabling connections among persistent identifiers, or PIDs. This is we're going to have hopefully 4 talks. I think we're still waiting for our last speaker to join, but we'll get started without her and assume she'll join a little bit later. And if not, we'll have a little bit of extra time. So this is really kind of a thematic session. So we're not doing breakouts or any kind of complicated things. We're just having a series of presentations focused on this theme to kind of get thought going, and also to potentially get input from you on how we as a community are working to address some of the challenges that you'll hear about. So if I move on my slides here, we'll have 4 speakers. I'll get us started and talk about my particular interest in this session and why we organized this session. And then we'll have Ted Haberman, Madison Langseth, and Shelley Stahl give talks as well, focused on their own perspective on this question of connecting PIDs, enabling connections, and the sort of broader PID ecosystem. My talk is going to kind of start from a narrow use case and expand out. Ted's going to give a broader view focused on data site metadata. Madison will talk about her work within the USGS, looking at PIDs of different types. And then Shelley, again, assuming Shelley is able to join the session, we'll talk about her work and the broader work within an RDA group on complex citations, which encompasses relationships, among other things. So we will get going here. Oh, I see Shelley is in the chat. Okay, great. So Shelley is here. So we're all good to go, and I'll get us started. So for myself, this particular topic is coming out of a project called FAIR Facilities and Instruments, which is an NSF FAIR Open Science funded project that's focusing on persistent identifiers for instruments and facilities. And this, as I'll get into a little bit, comes out of broader work within NCAR and with collaborators looking at persistent identifiers for data sets, software, and other things. And this is sort of the next step in some of our discussions there. I didn't introduce myself, I'm realizing now. So I'm Matt Marinick from the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And I've been working on this type of thing for PIDs for quite a while at this point. So this project, as I said, is focused on persistent identifiers for research facilities and instrumentation. It's a research coordination network grant. So we're not developing technology, we're bringing expertise and communities together to dig into this topic. We're now in year 3 of a 3-year project, so I'll go into some of the things we've learned. So we've been compiling use cases, as I said, connecting folks through workshops and so on, which I'll discuss. And then we're kind of in the recommendation phase, which is why we're really interested in this topic of connections, because any PIDs for instrumentation are almost always connected to other things. And I see Mark has a comment about the Data Science Journal, so please feel free to check that out as well. So this particular project is a multi-institutional collaboration, University of Colorado Boulder, Florida State University, and Stanford University. And I'll acknowledge my colleague Greg Stossmeister at NCAR, who's now retired, but was a key contributor for the first couple of years of the project. We have a website there, and all these slides are available in the ESIP session for this folder for this session. And this really came out of a mutual interest in this topic while realizing we were going about it in different ways. So this is organized around the concepts of FAIR. How do we enable people to find instruments and facilities? How do we enable people to access those facilities? How do we consistently capture relationships? So that was a key theme for our project. So we're getting to that now. And then reusability. How do we incorporate information about facilities and instruments into dataset provenance, metadata more consistently, which is itself a connection question. A few examples. These are some from NCAR. We've assigned DOIs to, relatively speaking, a small number. I think it's around 25 instrumentation or facility level things, depending on what terminology you use. So this airplane shown here on the bottom right is one example that has a DOI, and we're trying to track usage of that through the DOI. And then on the left, integrated surface flux system, which is a set of instrumentation that can be deployed in different places, also has a DOI. There's, as I said, about 25 of these. And we've been getting some metrics for these using DOIs, but it's also still a bit incomplete in terms of usage. A different set of PIDs in this space is the research resource identifier, which more or less comes out of the biomedical community, but has kind of been expanding over the years. This is where some of our partners have focused. So Claudius Mundoma, who's now at Stanford, has worked with a number of universities to assign RIDs to campus core facilities, such as microscopy, materials facilities, X-ray, and things like that. And their interests are also in metrics, but they're different. And so in this case, what this is showing is he actually got these identifiers on the campus map as a way to indicate their value, but also potentially help identify which facilities are where on the campus. So accessibility and discoverability are as much of an interest of Claudius's and folks who worked in this area than others. But these are just two examples of two identifiers that have been used for this purpose. I want to note that when we're talking about connections and PIDs, that there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and their interests are sometimes different. Their knowledge of PIDs often varies. The specific PIDs that they are exposed to and they hear about through their networks are often different. So, publishers work with different PIDs than facility operators, than with private industry, sometimes than with academic research institutions. So there's a lot of variance in this space in terms of the stakeholders, their interests, their knowledge of identifiers, and also their interest in the connections among them. So within our project, we've done a couple big workshops, and some of you who I've seen on the call attended those. We've had some focus group discussions with facility and instrument providers, and then we've been working to identify key challenges and opportunities, developing some initial recommendations and best practices. For the purpose of this particular session, I'm not going to go through all of kind of what we're learning in this project. We've got some documents that we've produced that can get into more detail, but I want to highlight a few things, and then I'll get farther into the connection kind of question. This is the theme of this session. So our first workshop was in 2023, and we dug into a lot of details here. I've highlighted a couple of kind of big takeaways that we described in our report, linked at the bottom, which kind of touch on this question of connections. So the PID systems, I'll come back to this in a future slide, but there's really a wide range of PIDs being used. And I think what you'll hear across these talks in this session also covers several different types of PIDs. It's also inconsistent. There's different types of PIDs being used for different purposes. For the research instrumentation case, there's multiple types of PIDs being used. So that's one of the, I think, main motivators of this PID discussion around connections, from my point of view, is how do we understand this ecosystem and leverage it optimally to support better connections and using those connections for understanding data, resources, research, and all of the provenance. Another thing that we discussed a lot in this first workshop was metadata and how metadata and PIDs are complementary. PIDs alone cannot solve all research traceability and reproducibility challenges, just to say that explicitly. So again, I think that's where PIDs and metadata perhaps support connections in ways that PIDs alone cannot provide, and we'll get into that. And I think Ted's discussion of metadata for the data site system will get into that in detail. All right, so following on from that, a couple of images here. So we put this together as we were kind of following on from that first workshop. We tried to get a grasp on the diversity of PIDs being used for many different things. This is not a full representation of all the PIDs in our research space, but I think captures many of them. It's probably not complete either. I just added another arrow to this yesterday as I was preparing this slide. So, orchids are used for people. That's probably the most straightforward thing. But after that, there's almost always more than one arrow pointing to these different things. I think this is a big challenge that us who are perhaps more knowledgeable in this PID space sometimes lose track of. That people who are new to this or who are just learning about PIDs, this is really confusing, and we've experienced this in our workshops multiple times. People who are new to this don't understand why there's not just one PID being used for data sets, for facilities, for software, for samples, for projects, for organizations. It's really confusing, and we're still trying to get a grasp on this. There is a new data policy, national data policy working group that's trying to kind of get a grasp on this, but just want to highlight this point. And so connections among these is really key, and that's what I'm trying to get to here. How do we understand this space and perhaps use connections within metadata or within other contexts to simplify this image a little bit. Another way of looking at this is, the sort of network diagram. This is just kind of a cartoon version. This doesn't really mean anything. I've been using this slide for a few years now, but just to depict that, again, there's connections between data and services and publications and people and instruments and facilities and organizations. And the ecosystem that I showed on the previous slide kind of casts onto this network in different ways. There are ontologies that have been developed that are more formal, that structure these things in a more formal way. But again, the PID ecosystem is really complex, and the connections in some ways are as important or as useful as the PIDs themselves, I would argue. Now, this is kind of an overview slide, but if you take a specific lens, when you zoom in on instruments or something, which we've done in our project, you might get a little bit narrower view of the relationship space, but you still get quite a complex space. So this is, again, a fairly simple diagram that one of our colleagues, Matthew Murray, put together just to try to get his own understanding on the instrument PID space and all its connections. And within this relatively simple kind of instrument-centric view of PIDs, there's still multiple types of PIDs that are at play here. There's DOIs, different flavors. There's RORs for institutions. There's RRIDs, which are, again, being used in the biomedical and the university space. DOIs are being used for a bunch of different things on this page. Funders, which weren't on the previous slide, they also have a different PID system called the Open Funder Registry. There's different PIDs being used for GitHub, things in GitHub. So the connections among PIDs and among resources are really open-ended and challenging at this point. And so that's what we're trying to get into in this session is, what are your experiences with this? How have you attempted to either capture these relationships or structure them in metadata or in other kinds of information? Do you expose relationships to users? If so, how? Things of that nature. Just to finish my talk here, I've got a couple of quick slides and then we'll move on. So in our second workshop, we dug a bit more into some of those things, but we also talked at a larger level about strategy, national or local PID strategies, infrastructures. And one thing we came back to is more engagement is needed with journal publishers, editors on PID incorporation. And I know Shelley is on the call and maybe you can touch on that in her comments. So what we're doing in our project is we have one more workshop planned. So this is a bit of an announcement and advertisement if you're interested in this topic. The connections is going to be one of the themes for the workshop, which is why we're focusing on this now. But we're also trying to get to specific guidance for specific stakeholders, whether it's data providers, instrument providers, publishers, funders. We're working towards that in this workshop. So we've got a webpage here again, which I see has been put in the chat by Joseph. So thank you, Joseph. If you're interested, just let me know, and we'll make sure you hear about the workshop when it comes up. But I think I will stop there. And I guess if anybody has any immediate questions from me, we can take those. If not, we can move on to Ted and get into our next talk. So anyone want to ask a question at this point? Or any immediate comment or reaction?
Yeah, hi, Matt. This is Madison.
Yes.
I'm curious, in the groups that are kind of involved in this project, who is driving the desire to have PIDs for instruments? Because I know within USGS, I kind of do a lot of the identifier type evangelism, I guess. But, in talking to groups, I've asked around, like, do you guys want persistent identifiers for your kind of equipment and things like that? And it has been always, no, we don't need that. We don't want to really make these, we have internal identifiers. We don't want to make them public. And so I'm just curious where that driving force is coming from.
Yeah, I think it's coming from providers, but it's probably at a more like maybe a facility level. We discussed this in our first workshop, which I won't totally recap, but what is a facility and what is an instrument? Sometimes there's just semantic confusion about that. But I think it's the interest has been in groups who have something that people outside of their group use. So like the airplane, people can propose to use the airplane to fly, kind of arbitrary
Yeah, right.
missions to study things in the atmosphere. People on campuses, they have, X-ray machines or microscopy facilities that, they want people to propose to use, right? So they're trying to kind of get these things more visibility, and then also trace their usage, so that they can indicate their value to whoever provides funding. So that tends to be where it's coming from in my experiences. People who are providing instrumentation or facilities, again, however those are defined, that they want more people to use and that they want to understand the usage for. Thanks, Madison. All right. Well, let's move on to Ted. So Ted's going to talk next. If you do have questions, put them in the chat or in the notes, and we'll make sure we take those. We will be doing questions after each talk, so no need to hold on to them. But if there are questions for everyone, we'll also probably have a few minutes at the end for those. So go ahead, Ted, who's going to talk about connecting PIDs and metadata.
Thanks, Matt. Are we seeing some slides?
Yes.
Or one slide? Great. Madison, by the way, you can't do good science without knowing the instruments that you use. So good science really depends on good instrument identifiers, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm going to talk about connecting PIDs and metadata and using DataCite as an example. Many people here, obviously, probably everybody is familiar with DataCite. It's a DOI provider and a repository. And one of the important things about DataCite is there's currently over 3,000 members. And many of those members have multiple repositories, which are sort of subsets of DataCite that they control. So there's over 3,000 repositories in DataCite, even though it's really one repository. There's over 60 million resources in DataCite now. They have 28 different types. The picture that Matt shows a lot of different arrows going to different things from DataCite because there are a lot of different resources. And today we're talking about relations. So there's 36 different relation types that can exist between these resources. In DataCite, and of course, one resource can have multiple different kinds of relations. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is which of these relation types are being used. And I wanted to mention first is identical to, which is one of the relation types, because there's almost 12 million resources in DataCite that is identical to. It's really outstanding and blows the axes on all the plots like this one. So this one shows the other resource types in addition to identical to that have more than 500,000 occurrences. Is a big one, almost 9 million occurrences of that. Then there's a cluster that are sort of around 5 million, and then between 3 and 4, and then a few others. There are a lot of other relation types. I mentioned there are 36 relation types. So these are the big ones in the bar diagram here, and then smaller ones shown in the list. So what I want to do is go over some of these, some of the heavy hitters. I mentioned identical to with about 12,000 occurrences, and these are the repositories that have those relation types of identical to. And hopefully y'all are looking at this and you see repositories that you mentioned, Legacy IGSN for Geoscience Australia, CSAR, and also CSAR, a couple different CSAR repositories. And so these identical to, they're used mostly because the international generic sample numbers, IGSNs, and many people here have been involved in developing and using IGSN as it got larger and larger, decided it wanted to take advantage of the DataCite backend. infrastructure. They merged into DataCite, and legacy IGSNs were given DOIs, and they were connected to those new DOIs using IsIdentical2. So samples have really become a major piece. They're the second or third largest resource type in DataCite, and of course, many of them are related to ESIP and the ESIP community. So ESIP has or the IGSN, Kirsten and others, Kirsten have had a lot of impact in DataCite, and we see that here. There's a great link, by the way, for description in the DataCite metadata about enriching IGSN metadata in DataCite, which is definitely worth taking a look at. Is part of 8.6 million in part of, and these are the these are the repositories that have that. The big player here is Zenodo. Some of you may be familiar with communities. There are several thousand communities in Zenodo. And communities are important because they're sort of like projects in a way. They're collections of related resources in Zenodo, and Zenodo metadata uses is part of to say that this resource, this paper, this data set, this software is part of a community. And so holding those things together in communities is what is part of is used for primarily. Its version of, there's a discussion yesterday about versioning. So its version of, again, Zenodo using is version of quite a bit, and also Archive. Archive is a preprint server keeping track of versions of preprints. In Zenodo, Zenodo has a versioning of DOIs built in, and this is a description of how they do that versioning. So it's based on the relation type of is version of, and if you use Zenodo, as many people here do, you know about versioning and in various ways, either data sets or software or other things. Take advantage of that connection between multiple DOIs. One that I'm really interested in, or one of my favorite relations, is has metadata. Over 5 million resources in DataCite use the has metadata relation. One of these, I think, is probably familiar to a lot of us, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF. GBIF is a big user of DataCite and a big user of has metadata. The other is FAO, International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. But GBIF really uses has metadata in a very interesting way. GBIF has many data sets. And when you're using GBIF, you query those data sets, and you get a data set, a query result back. And one of the things that GBIF does that's really amazing for reproducibility is they give a DOI to the query results. As far as I know, they've been a leader in this for a long time, and they may be the only repository that does that. So they have a lot of DOIs related to subsets of GBIF that people have retrieved, because they want to be able to reproduce the subset at a later time. And they use that by pointing back to actually the query that was used to create that subset from the DataCite DOI. So that's how has metadata is used in GBIF. In FAO, it's a little bit different, this long name, and the name of the repository is fao.itbgrfa. So if we look at the has metadata, the section has metadata from one of their metadata records, it looks like this. This shows the elements of the related identifier. The important thing about the has metadata one is it includes a couple special special elements. One is the schema URI, so it's a location for the schema that's used for this metadata that's pointed to. In this case, it's an XML schema. And then the related identifier is shown here. It's actually a URL. It's not a DOI. But so this points back to, in this case, metadata that's in XML following this descriptors schema. And the interesting thing about this is that FAO is actually using the DOI as an internal identifier in their repository of this this is domain repository, domain metadata, and it's taking advantage of that DOI as a local identifier within their repository. But this is really important because this is the connection between DataCite, which is a generalist repository with repositories from all over the world, many different types, pointing back to metadata, which is domain specific. And so this is really the connection between DataCite and these, say, institutional repositories or domain repositories. This record happens to have 2 of these. The second one is using a different schema, so it's more like another kind of, this is actually Darwin Core, domain repository, domain metadata in Darwin Core. And once again, they're using that DOI as the identifier in their local repository with another type. So related identifiers can be of many different types. Many of them are DOIs, but in this case, they're URLs. So that's another thing that we can take advantage of in DataCite. The metadata in DataCite has a variety of levels of detail. And I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. So on the left-hand side here, we have the resource type general. This is an example for instruments that Matt was talking about, something that I've also been working on. So that instrument, the resource type general, is the least detailed description. Slightly more detailed is the resource type, which is a full text rather than a vocabulary. So the instrument type can be described with more detail. The title of the instrument and an acronym for it provide a little bit more detail. And then 2 different kinds of descriptions, either the abstract or the technical information, provide connections. These are typically, these are descriptions within the metadata, but the also important part that we've been talking about here are the relations. So, and these are other things like the has metadata that we were just talking about, other metadata records in different schema. Described by could be a pointer to some documentation. Has part or is part of is how we describe groups of instruments that might be together, or sensors, instruments on a platform or sensors on an instrument. Related identifiers, references, and is cited by for papers, and then collects and is collected by for data sets. An instrument collects data or a data set is collected by. These are the important connections in DataCite. Contributors are also important, non-authors that contribute to the development of a resource. A couple of kinds that are important for instruments: hosting institution, the data collector, and maybe a sponsor, which is in-kind support. So these are contributors. Other related identifiers that are connected. And then funders are obviously important. They're the organizations that make so much possible. Funder identifiers and award identifiers are both in the game here, and important links between, in this case, instruments, but actually any kind of resource and other people, other organizations, and other resources. One of the important use cases for DataCite is getting a DOI. And unfortunately, many organizations that are using DataCite sort of stop there, and the use case is really the give me a DOI as soon as possible with the least possible metadata. The red boxes here are the elements that are mandatory. So it's really, if we want to do well and use DataCite effectively, then we want to go beyond the required fields to make these connections to all these different kinds of things. So it's important as we make these connections to measure the connectivity. This is a connectivity diagram for a university, happens to be in Australia. And there are a number of different identifiers here that are used in metadata. This repository has about 500 items in it. It's not a huge one. And for each of these resources, for each of these types of identifiers, the green percentage shows the number of resources that have all of their identifiers. The yellow ones show partial, some of their identifiers, and then the red sections show none. So this helps us look at in a quantitative way at connectivity in this single repository, and identify what they're doing well, mostly affiliations and RORs in this case, and areas where they might be able to improve completeness, like award numbers or funders or even ORCIDs. If we have a number of different repositories, as we do in so many cases, we can use a measure like this to find bright spots. This is similar diagrams for 20 universities in Australia. Southern Cross is sort of near the middle in this case. 20 different repositories here. We're looking for bright spots for good examples. The green areas, again, are DOIs, resources in these repositories that are complete. In this case, this is for RORs, for organizational identifiers. And then the red areas are missing. So down at the bottom, we see Edith Cowan and Bond University are great examples of repositories that are using ROR well. So they're bright spots that we can use as examples for these others, and we can learn from them about how they're implementing these identifiers in their repository so well. And then other repositories in this group might adopt practices from these bright spots. And of course, these all change as a function of time. And what we would like to see is the diagram across all repositories, in university repositories in Australia, in this case, becoming more complete for RORs. The goal is a connected information ecosystem. There's a lot of big repositories out there that are contributing to this, and that's the last slide.
Thanks, Ted. Questions for Ted? There were a couple comments in the chat. Maybe I'll just highlight and then we can see if there's other questions. But so John Ralph, and this maybe was in reference to my talk as well, but what about federally approved PID systems versus the other PID systems? John, if you're on, do you want to expand on that or add any detail?
It was something that was in the Nelson memo, and they were talking about there are only certain types of PID systems which meet whatever those federal requirements are. DOIs, of course, do meet those requirements, and so do ORCID IDs. But some of these PID systems may be quote unquote less formal and may not meet those requirements. So I'm wondering if we, as a group, had thought about any of the ramifications of that.
Yeah, that's a good. Go ahead, Ted. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, RORs. Sorry, you mentioned ORCIDs and DOIs. They're both handles, and handles have a structure which is, I think that in the Nelson memo, and I think you mentioned this, John, is sort of like the nature of the identifier itself, rather than the repository that mints that identifier. And I'm not that familiar with the details of that requirement, but I think most of the ones that we're dealing with probably meet it. Certainly ORCIDs, DOIs, RORs. Yeah. Let's see, Ken had a question. of the non-mandatory fields, there are a handful that you would focus on that you go, well, can those that minimum metadata is something that's incredibly bothersome and that we should stop talking about it. It depends on what you want to do for earth science. One of the things is spatial extent is there, which is important. We just added to the new version of DataCite also temporal extent. So now we have the two elements of the ISO extents. The descriptive pieces, I think, are important. There are a lot of repositories in DataCite that don't have abstracts. The resources that they're describing definitely have abstracts. Abstracts are super important for full text searching, which is sort of used a lot of places. So it really depends on the use cases, the F, A, and I and R use cases. I've given a bunch of talks about DataCite elements that support all four of those. There's a variety. DataCite has about 60 plus elements. So, and we have ways to evaluate completeness of all of them, and to evaluate how well certain use cases are addressed, and find opportunities for improving completeness to improve that. So.
Thanks, Ted. There's more discussion in the chat there, which is good stuff. And I just want to also mention Mark Parsons noted that the GBIF example he showed with the relations they had was essentially implementing RDA's dynamic data citation, which a number of repositories have implemented.
Mark, if you have a list of those repositories, or even a few of them, maybe you could share that, because that would be great.
Well, and Mark, I was actually going to ask, is the usage of DataCite that's shown here, it's kind of in the spirit of the RDA recommendation, or is that something that's built into their recommendation?
Yeah, I think it's definitely in the spirit. The recommendation doesn't specify a technical approach. But the core of the recommendation is put a PID on a query and be able to reproduce that.
Yeah, I'd love to find more examples of it, because I think it's really a great.
My favorite, just off the top of my head, is Ocean Networks Canada. They are doing some incredible things with PIDs. Raina Jenkins was in charge there. She's since moved to WDS. I'm not sure who's in charge now, but they basically did a whole overhaul of their system and did some really incredible things with PIDs for all kinds of things. But I have a list and a paper. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. All right. Well, I think for the sake of time, we're going to move on. But thanks, Ted. Please feel free to keep going in the chat. I see some good stuff added there in response to John's comments about federal requirements. So that's some good discussion there. So thanks, Ted. We're going to next move to Madison Langseth from USGS, who's going to talk about USGS work around PIDs, specifically, I think, for people and organizations.
Right. Yes. You seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Madison Langseth, and I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey's Science Data Management team. I am responsible for leading communities of practice related to data management and developing tools to help our researchers perform data management tasks. Specifically, I manage the USGS's Asset Identifier service, which we use to mint DOIs for our data and software products. So today, I'm going to kind of narrow in a little bit on this kind of topic of connections across identifiers and talk very specifically about how we are using people and organization identifiers within USGS digital object identifiers for our data and software. Okay, so at the USGS, we are using ORCID IDs for people and Research Organization Registry, or ROR IDs, for organizations. These two types of identifiers we've heard mentioned already, but they are a little bit different in how they're curated. So ORCID IDs are curated by individuals, and they are associated with kind of author and contributor names within DOI metadata. ROR IDs are curated by the scholarly research community, meaning that individual organizations do not necessarily have direct control over their ROR ID, and a member of the community can request a ROR ID for an organization, even if they are not affiliated with the organization. And that'll come into play when I talk about how we're using RORs within USGS. So ROR IDs are associated with organizational author and contributor names in DOI metadata, or at least this is how we're using them in USGS, and can also be used to identify individual authors' affiliations in DOIs and ORCID IDs. So ORCID IDs and ROR IDs provide better credit to authors and contributors by disambiguating names. They also increase transparency in who is creating data, and they can improve discovery and tracking of research outputs by research institution. Finally, they can enhance system integrations. So for example, if two systems kind of contain information about people, the ORCID IDs can be used as kind of foreign keys to join information across the systems. So based on a decision from the Department of the Interior, so USGS falls under the Department of Interior for those who may not understand that or know about that kind of organizational structure. So there was a decision from the Department of Interior solicitor basically saying that we're not able to require the use of ORCID IDs specifically, so that specific identifier for people. Instead, we have been trying to incentivize researchers to acquire an ORCID ID and have their Active Directory account within USGS updated with the ORCID ID. So Active Directory is our authoritative source for information about people, primarily for kind of the purpose or for use within kind of human resources realm. However, we have begun using the data within that system, or at least the subset of that data that can be made public. We've been making it available via services so our publication pipelines can leverage that data about people. And one way we are incentivizing the use of ORCID IDs is by having our researchers' USGS staff profiles automatically updated with their published products like journal articles, data, and software, provided that their ORCID IDs are included first in Active Directory and then thus in downstream systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in just a minute. So as I alluded to on the previous slide, we have developed a shared people lookup service that we call the People Picker. And the People Picker is a solution for managing information about USGS people, as well as non-USGS contributors. So people data for USGS people are retrieved daily from our Active Directory system. And those data are curated by user account managers, and they're considered our gold source of USGS people data. Individual records are tied to an identifier in Active Directory, which is unique within the Department of the Interior. So we have these unique identifiers kind of just within the scope of Department of Interior. So when a person leaves USGS and their record is removed from Active Directory, though, the People Picker retains their information. The People Picker, if you start to say it too much, it gets a little tricky. The People Picker also gathers information about non-USGS people, and this information is supplied by USGS collaborators. So if the ORCID ID of the person is known, we use that as the unique identifier. Otherwise, a system-generated unique ID is created. In the future, we hope to develop a platform to enable kind of community curation of these data by data and content managers within USGS. And again, kind of the idea behind kind of curating this information about non-USGS contributors is further use in kind of our publication systems, so we can keep track of who's collaborating with us on our products. So the People Picker is comprised of a relational database, user interface components, and web services. So the interface components allow for autocomplete and can be used to search on multiple fields such as ORCID ID, email, or name. And currently there is a Vue.js version and a Flask version for kind of easy integration with existing applications within USGS. The People Picker has GraphQL compliant web services that allow for subscriptions, so you can kind of listen to data changes, and filterable queries, so you only get the data that you need. And currently, the People Picker is integrated into 2 enterprise tools. We have the science-based data release tool, which is a Flask application for initiating the data publication process at USGS, and the Asset Identifier service, which has a Vue.js front end and is used for reserving DOIs for data and software. So if a USGS person does not have their ORCID ID in Active Directory, the ORCID ID will not be available in the People Picker and therefore will not be associated with their data publications. If their ORCID ID is not in their DOI metadata, their publication will not be included in their USGS staff profile. Since the People Picker does leverage an internal identifier from Active Directory, once a person has their ORCID ID added to Active Directory, we can then bulk update all of their DOIs to include their ORCID ID. We have tried other forms of outreach and education, but the incentive of having their publications displayed on their USGS staff profile seems to be the thing that has been most successful in increasing the number of ORCID IDs in Active Directory. And also just to say another thing about kind of previously, we did allow people to kind of hand type in their ORCID ID kind of when they're getting a DOI. And there were so many kind of errors associated with that. And the data quality was just really horrible, which is why we're kind of making this push towards getting all of the ORCID IDs into a single place within Active Directory to kind of feed them other systems. Okay, so we have decided to require that organizations have ROR ID, a ROR ID specifically, in order to be listed as an author or a contributor for data or software products. Similar to the People Picker, we have created a GraphQL service to provide ROR data for applications. We have a monthly cron job that ingests the ROR data dump into our database. And if an organization does not have a ROR ID, we will, my team will work to submit a ROR request to have a ROR ID created for the organization. And the turnaround time there for creating new ROR IDs is generally 2 to 4 weeks. And so that can be problematic for some authors who really want to get things out the door quickly, but usually it ends up being an okay timeline. Additionally, in 2024, we submitted a bulk request for ROR to create ROR IDs for all USGS science centers. We debated internally about doing this for a while because USGS science centers change with relative frequency. So there are mergers, splits, enclosures, usually at least one, if not multiple, every year. The ROR schema, however, is able to handle these types of changes through the use of successor and predecessor relationships, as well as the status field to denote whether the organization is still active. So given that kind of structure in their schema, we decided that would be great. We would still be able to kind of track those changes and handle those changes. So we did decide to proceed with that request. Now, the benefits to using ORCID and ROR IDs show up most prominently, at least from my perspective, in DataCite Commons. As an organization, you can get a summary report of your publications affiliated with your ROR ID. You can see kind of your most prolific creators and contributors, or at least the most prolific ones that have ORCID IDs. At USGS, we only started using the People Picker for populating ORCID IDs and requiring the use of ROR IDs in 2024, so last year. So we do have a backlog of historic DOIs to update with both ORCID IDs and ROR IDs. And that will make this information that we can glean from DataCite kind of way more accurate and powerful. But it will take time for us to kind of work through that backlog and get those updates made. All right, so that's just a quick kind of overview of how we are leveraging people and organization identifiers within USGS. And I'd love to answer any questions or enter into any discussion with folks. So yeah, back to you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Madison. Yeah, if you have questions, please put them in there. You might want to look through the chat, Madison. People had fun with your people picker and the tongue twister aspect of that. Steve Young also is making jokes about checking out of USGS but not leaving. But I think I want to actually use that to ask a real question, which is, to what extent, is there a reason or a way that people would not be there? You know, like, would you take people out of the people picker at some point? And if so, is there reasons for that?
The goal is not to, right? So we only have this data back so far, and from when we first started the people picker, right? So we don't have a ton of historical data, but the idea is these records of people are driving kind of information that's going into the DOIs and things like that. And so especially if you have published, right, in a DOI, and you have a DOI for data, software, or publication through USGS, we need to maintain a record of you. And so I can't, maybe some folks can propose, some scenarios, but I can't think of a reason why we would want to remove people from the system.
Okay.
And it's just, the information that you would see kind of when you're publishing, right? So their name, their ORCID, and their affiliation.
And one quick follow-up for me, and then Rama has a question. My follow-up would be, do you have an estimate on like coverage of ORCIDs? Do you feel like you've got 20%, 50%, 80%? Is it even possible to get a grasp on kind of coverage there?
Yes, we can. Right off the top of my head, I can't give that to you, but we do have folks who are doing some analytics on ORCID ID coverage. And so I could definitely get that information, but I don't have it handy at the moment. But yeah, we are, there are little tiger teams working on that and trying to kind of improve the coverage. It has been a challenge for us, especially with the DOI solicitors kind of decision on like us not being able to require ORCID IDs specifically.
Okay, I see Maricella just actually put a comment on the chat in there, so that might be some insight there. But Rama had a question. Are federal government privacy regulations a concern, given that ORCIDs are personally identifiable information?
Can you say that again?
Are federal government privacy regulations a concern, given that ORCIDs are personally identifiable information?
Well, we have had our kind of privacy officers kind of look into it. And I mean, given that when people publish that information, the ORCID is included in the publication, we don't feel that it is a privacy concern.
Okay.
Especially, and just one more follow-up, especially because ORCID does have, ORCID itself does have kind of very strict privacy guidelines around like kind of the ORCID profile and things like that, and the ability for folks to keep that as open or closed as they would like. And so they are, folks are always, given our solicitors decision, there's no requirement, I guess, that they get it into Active Directory and actually make that available.
Okay, Matt Jones, go ahead.
Madison, that was great. So I'm curious about you were talking about historical people and affiliations of these things. Have you started using ISNIs for that? And do you have like a way to register like we want to use ISNIs for historical people, but we haven't figured out a way to register historical people with ISNIs if they don't already have one. Does USGS have a way of doing that?
No, but that's an interesting concept. So we're working with our team, our like on the publishing side, so like the USGS reports and things like that, because they have way more, like their publication history goes all the way back to, you know, like the 1800s, and so we're working on trying to come up with a solution on like how to manage people in a more standardized way, right? And so that might be something for us to look into. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have we haven't looked into that yet. So I definitely will kind of explore that.
Okay, and we have a question about that in the chat, Matt, so if you want to respond to that there. But there is one more question here. Let's see, from Bob Downs, for you, Madison. Are errors encountered within the assignment of orchids in your database?
So yes, we do come up with that. And often that comes to light through people's USGS like profile, right? So like if things didn't get populated properly as they wanted it to, right? Like so people publish and they're waiting for their data, their publication to show up on their profile. And when it doesn't, that's when they start reaching out to kind of my team or our website team to inquire about it. And we kind of sort through some of those errors at that point and kind of then work on correcting it upstream in Active Directory. You know, another thing that I see a lot is that I think there's still a lot of education that we need to do around ORCID IDs. I see a lot of people who have multiple orchids. And so they'll have one in Active Directory, and then they have another one that they're kind of using for actually publishing. And they both kind of look like the same person, but you know, they probably got them at different times. And so that's something that we haven't quite figured out. You know, we end up changing things in Active Directory to the ORCID ID that they actually want to be using. But there's the lingering question of how do you manage the duplication on the ORCID side.
Right, and as people noted earlier, and you mentioned as well, people curate their own profiles. It's up to them to address that, right? I mean, if they can, right. Which they can't always. All right. Well, thanks, Madison. Yeah,
Madison, you said a lot of people with multiple orchids. I've seen about 4 out of maybe 4,000 people, 4,000 orchids. So what's a lot?
Yeah, well, I don't have all these data, right? Because I haven't specifically been the person to look into this. And so a lot is just like, I have addressed it multiple times. So to me, I'm like, oh, that's a lot, right? But out of the thousands of people in USGS, yeah, probably not like really that many. But yeah, it was one of the concerns that came up for the team that was kind of analyzing ORCID ID usage at USGS, was that there were cases where, you know, there were multiple orchids. Again, probably not a lot if we're like using really accurate terminology, but probably a small percentage.
Yeah. John Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually run into a few duplicates in the last few days. The other thing that we have is sort of an education and usage challenge with ORCID IDs. Some people make them private. Some people get their publication name wrong, so it just has their last name or something. So there's some, you know, education and outreach perhaps we might consider doing to let people know that it's important to have their publication name match, well, how they would like their name to appear in publications, for example, and to make sure it's public and to make sure it's actually up to date. That's a harder one, but at least having it be readable by the public. And I've seen a few cases of that where, yes, the ORCID exists. No, you can't find out anything about it. Sorry. So there's some challenges there, you know.
Yeah, we've definitely encountered that at NCAR as well. But again, that's the way the ORCID system is designed, right? Is people have control over these things, and if that's their choice, whether for whatever reason, that's the way it can be.
And that's where I think like some of the incentives come into play, right? Because even if we were mandating ORCIDs, you would still run into that, right? Like people not, curating their profiles and their ORCID IDs the way that we would want them to kind of promote this idea of openness. So the more incentives that we can provide, make life easier for them, the more kind of adoption we'll see. Yeah,
that's a good point. So we'll move on, but thank you, Madison. This is a great discussion, and I'll just note Ted's comment at the end. ORCID profiles that are not public is much more common and more of a problem than duplicates in his experience. So, all right, well, thank you, Madison. And our final speaker of the session is Shelley Stahl from the American Geophysical Union. So welcome, Shelley. And Shelley will be talking about the Research Data Alliance Working Group on Complex Citations.
Thank you. I'm excited to share all of this with you. I know many of you have actually been participating in the working group, so hopefully I'll have updates for you on that. I'm putting in the recommendation that is currently in review with the RDA tab and council, and we just did a presentation to the organizational assembly yesterday. So so far so good. So I will share my slides. So the orientation here is at the moment of publication for the context of a complex citation. And the humor here is that we're really thinking about this as being a very simple thing. So complex citation and simple citation are kind of two sides of a coin. So the problem, well, let me walk you back. So this all started at a town hall at AGU, December of 2020, online, of course. And the town hall that we were running was called Why is Citing Data Still Hard? And what came up very loudly as one of the challenges, and there were multiple, but the loudest one came from Deb Agarwal, who had just published a paper where she was really challenged with how to make sure, representing the Ameriflex towers, how could she make sure that the data sets used by researchers mapped directly to the folks that had actually created those data sets, no matter which tower was engaged. And she didn't want just the general ESS Dive repository where this data is stored, recognized. She actually wanted to go all the way back to give attribution to the actual data creators. And the best way she figured out how to do this was to actually do a data paper. And we know that those authors are locked in time, and that in fact, instruments as complex as a flex tower, those authors continue to change. So she brought this up, and it caught the attention of a number of folks in that session, and that was the impetus for this work. So the problem was when you have 40 is just a nominal number, but even at AGU, it's 40 or so citations of a digital object that you want to put in the reference section of your paper so that the journal creates the metadata necessary for machine actionable linkage between those digital objects and the moment in time, the findings for that research. Many journals, including AGU, will push that large number of citations into the supplementary information or some other black hole where the linkages won't take place, and all of the terrible things on the right-hand side happen. There's the attribution doesn't happen. You're not able to measure the actual use of those digital objects, data, or whatever it is. There's not transparency. And the fact is, the supplement of a paper is not considered part of the scientific record in the world of publishers. So there's no guarantee from a publishing house that will be maintained at the same level as the actual publication itself. And I know of multiple situations from multiple publishers where they have lost, quote unquote, lost their supplement where in fact the paper, the scientific record, it goes into locks and clocks and is duplicated just in case those publishers go under or such. So we started with 3 use cases. We didn't become an RDA working group until after a couple years. We were trying to build up the number of use cases and get our arms around the size of the problem, explore if there's any other way to do this. Were there existing solutions out there? Answer, some came close, but they weren't quite there. So the British Oceanographic Data Center, which is really very similar, I imagine, I think Karen Stocks is on this call. So to any of the cruises that are going out there and the many instrumentation, the levels and layers of data based on research efforts or just a ship going out or one of the other types of instrument captures, and being able to cite those individual data sets. The IPCC has a really fantastic use case. They want to be able to give attribution to the figures, the data that went into the figures in the report. Big deal. The working groups are implementing FAIR, and this is one of the things that they feel is going to be able to jump the gap of being able to do that with a single DOI on those figures. And then, of course, our original Ameriflex pain point that Deb Agarwal. Deb retired, but is now back at the labs, and Joan Damereau is helping to fill in just in case Deb's not available. And Joan brings physical samples as a new use case, being able to cite IGSNs or RIDs and such. So here are the workflow actors. And it gives you a sense for how complex the problem is, because, and I don't mean that as a pun, as in complex citation, but I kind of do. You have the original creator of a digital object, so it's assumed that that exists, and such that you're going to take it and a variety of others. This could be data, it could be software, physical samples, it could be an instrument, it could be anything that has a PID. No matter what kind of PID. We are encouraging DOIs because of the fact that publishers recognize a DOI better than they do any other type of PID when it comes to a digital object, but believing in the fact that eventually publishers will do better. And if you include, say, a software heritage ID, eventually a linkage could be created in the future once those are recognized at the same level. Author team comes to create what we're calling a complex citation object through some sort of generator. And it's intended that this is cross repository, although it could be within a single repository, but we're assuming that multiple repositories are engaged. The author team puts that that complex citation object in the paper, in the reference section. That's where the linkages take place. The journal recognizes this object and doesn't delete it. Amen, please. The DOI registry agency, which for any language paper other than Asian, it would be Crossref. So Crossref would be the DOI registry agency, unless it's Japanese, Chinese, or South Korean. I know there's other languages, but those are where the other registry agencies are located. Are 2 in China, 1 in Japan, and 1 in South Korea. Then event data works. For those of you who are familiar with event data, that's a thing, such that the complex citation object is recognized. And in our world, most importantly, the indexer gives attribution to the items within the complex citation. So if you're familiar with a collection, let's take Shakespeare's collection. A learned person who understands Shakespeare puts a list together of all of Shakespeare's collections such that the value of the collection is important. We are saying that the package, that this complex citation object, is not really important. It's not really adding value except to collect together what does have value. So we don't want the object itself to get credit, because that's not really a contribution to the scientific record. We want what's listed in the object to get credit. So that is the difference between a collection and what we're talking about, although the look and feel is going to be very similar. So here's our new vocabulary. So we have a complex citation object that we've talked about it. And I realize the danger of saying that the things inside this object are the linked digital objects because it sounds like a linked data object. We realize that. The authors of the paper realize that. We call it out. We just want you to know we don't mean linked data object. We are very specifically talking about the elements that are inside the complex citation object. This is a summary of the recommendations. The team is through these recommendations are talking about what, and now they're going to move on to how once we get through the process at RDA. So starting with number 1, ensure that proper credit, traceability, and transparency of these cited materials. So fantastic. So enough information is there to actually create that to happen, and that they're machine actionable. What I was talking about, the difference between a collection and a complex citation object, it's not that the object gets credit, but in fact, the elements inside, the linked digital objects. The third one, which combines recommendations 4 and 5, really leans in on the fact that this is intended to be a persistent identifier, that it's stable, identifiable, it's versioned, resolvable, and persistent. That this is a standard structure so that we all understand what it looks like, and no matter who's generating it, it's generating the same. And we talk about 2 PID graph levels. What this means is you're not citing a complex citation object inside a complex citation object. There's that concept of recursion. We're not going to do that. That was a request from the indexers. They wanted something that was easier for them to get their arms around. And so we, for an MVP, for our minimal viable product, we are pulling that in as a recommendation. And then the last one, that this is open, accessible, and flexible for different use cases. There's an open license and efficient metadata. That is the end of the presentation. There is the recommendation, of course, is much more lengthy. And I hope you take take some time to take a look at it. We did compare it, right, Mark Parsons, to the solutions that are coming out of ESIP and RDA for using queries to pull in the exact data that was used for research. But because it's cross repository, we have a number of different types of objects included. We felt this was a unique, separate problem to be solved. So here are all of the folks that were part of the writing of the recommendation and many, many more that were part of the working group. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shelley. So please feel free to add questions in the chat or raise your hand. I have one kind of related to what you just mentioned. So the recommendation is generic to which type of identifiers are being used, or kind of how does it connect to that broader PID ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks for that. We know that DOIs are the best. The publishers have best implemented a DOI to be quite straightforward. Other PIDs for digital objects, they are not focused on as much. Ascension numbers a little bit, but others are not as robust. Although I've heard now there's an intention in the future. So we want to honor what's actually been used. So wherever that digital object is, however you can cite it, I would say include it. Yes, thank you, Mark. I would say include it because what we're envisioning, this complex citation object would be persistent. So the linked object would be there. And if it could not be machine actionably linked through event data or whatever supports event data, maybe there'll be something new in the future, you could go back and reconnect it. So I would say include it no matter what, but just know that DOIs are preferred right now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Matt.
That was really interesting, Shelley. I'm curious about how what the relationship between these CCOs is, and the joint statement on data citation principles says to cite the specific subset and version of something that was used. And so when you have a CCO, that's by definition an aggregation. That's probably not the specific subset. How do you link those two things?
Oh yeah. So I think the intention would be to be fully in alignment with the joint. So such that the complex citation object is a list of citations. So the citation inside, the linked digital object inside, should be very accurate to what you're saying. So I would not be giving up, I would not want this to give up any accuracy. So kind of think of it as a little package that navigates through, or a big package, through the world of publication where it's fraught with spears and arrows because publishers are terrible with data citation processing. And if it can make it all the way through and get out the other side, then you have your viable citations connected to the paper in a way that dodged the problems that we have right now in production for publishers.
So just to be clear, like if I were to like want to use, say, the data from, 7-day period from one instrument on board a ship, and I wanted to cite that, but that had a PID that wasn't a DOI, and instead you want to embed that in a CCO, how would I point at that specific 7-day period of data from, say, a radar instrument on board the ship that does have a CCO object?
So however you would cite it today as a primary citation within the reference section, that's how you would cite it. We're not going to solve that problem for you. Mike, what we are going to solve for you is, let's say you want to look at 20 years of data at that place-based location, and it's coming off of a bunch of different ships, and it's in different places, such that you end up with 200 citations. We want to give you a way to get those 200 through without being told to deprecate them into the supplementary information.
Thanks.
Yep.
Mark, do you want to add to that? Or sorry, go ahead, Shelley.
I was just going to say, so if we have a problem citing something today, we're not solving that. It's the volume of things that we're going to solve.
So I was just going to say, so correct me if I'm wrong, Shelley, but it seems to be you could combine the use of dynamic data citation and complex data citation.
Yeah.
And so in the case that Matt gave, that 7-day period could be the PID for that query, which is bundled into the complex citation object.
Sure.
And I'd have to think through this more closely, and look at the CCO recommendations more closely. But you could also have, the 5-year object, whatever that is based off of a query, which still ripples down to the individual credits for all the little pieces. The big difference in the use cases, I think, between dynamic data citation and complex citation is dynamic data citation was really focused on the reproducibility aspect, the precise reference aspect, and not the credit piece. Whereas what Shelley's group has been working on is very much more focused on the credit piece.
Yeah, and Mark, just to make sure everybody knows, you really helped us navigate all of that. The fact that you use the word credit is really blowing my mind away, because that's a word that you and I've talked about at length, and it's really, we're enabling it. Yeah, we can't make it happen. But yes, that's absolutely it. And very interestingly, we really do think, and it would be fascinating to bring this back to ESIP, is when we talk about what the value statement here is and what does it mean, like when we're talking to the indexers, know what their job is. It's a I don't know, like a little mechanism that they've got that this says this data set was used for this paper, and there's a however they identify that within their systems. By the way, SciX has given us the support when we finally figure out how we're going to do this. SciX is this ADS group with Alberto Akamazi is going to go ahead and help us implement. And that to me is huge, just really huge. And hopefully we'll be able, Web of Science has been participating, but I'd rather do an open organization like SciX. Certainly Web of Science will be helpful for all of the other researchers and such. But the concept of what does it mean to actually cite data? What is that? Like the effervescent, not effervescent, but the what does it mean?
Ephemeral.
Yeah, ephemeral. Thank you. Ephemeral. The ephemeral meaning. I feel like in order for people to understand why attribution and credit matters is to actually talk about it. And the complex citation team, we keep hitting it. It's like, how do we explain to people why this matters so much? It's not only the data, it's the repository, it's the instrument. Physical samples are going to find a home here. So we've already talked to the IGSN folks and the RID folks. They definitely have a home here. And what does it mean to actually include them in a way that recognizes those contributions? So Mark, you are the best person to lead that conversation. I just have to say, I don't want to do it. If you're not doing it, I'm not doing it. But I think
Yeah,
it's
I'm not sure. Well, it's because it's a whole social cultural thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a much bigger. I mean, in our EOS article where we talked about credit, the ultimate sort of takeaway is talk about it. I mean, you have to sort of sit down before the project begins and think about, what people's roles are, how they're credited, how they're recognized, how it makes sense in their professional landscape, all that stuff. So it's
What does
not
it
just
mean?
hammering the scholarly credit of citations of papers into all these other artifacts, because we recognize them and reward them in very different ways, and we don't want to duplicate the scholarly research industrial complex, as John Wilbex calls it, for all these different things. Yeah,
So
getting very
that's-
meta there, but okay.
Yeah. No, I'm
For
grateful to all.
MetaMat J.
So we did the what, now we're on to the how. So if you're interested, please do join the working group, and we'll keep bringing this back to ESIP for additional counsel and review. You're welcome to give comments back on this recommendation. Just if you can, please do it through the RDA mechanism, or if that's too much for you, just send an email. So thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. So we have about 5 minutes. So if people do have overarching comments or questions that cut across, all these talks or on this theme, please feel free to, again, stick them in the chat or raise your hand. Maybe I'll ask one more sort of in the weeds question for you, Shelley, but is within the CCO, and I'm sure this is in the document, I just haven't had a chance to look at it, but are there any, is there a way to indicate, what type of thing this is? Like these are the data sets and these are the software and these are the instruments and these are the something else.
All right, deep breath. AGU's guidance for citing digital objects includes that. We recommend a bracketed description so it's clear what a data set and software is. And that has to do with how publishing works. Now, by tucking these inside a package to get through publication, you end up, that's not as worrisome because you're not asking the journal to figure it out and mark it properly and get it to the end result properly. However, the metadata, what the DOI is connected to or what the persistent identifier is connected to needs to be clear on what it is. So yes, it should be. It doesn't have to be visual. So one of the problems for journal production is you go from the author to the editor and reviewer, back to the author, editor and reviewer. Finally, there's acceptance. Let's hope those references are right. Then it goes through to people who don't know your discipline, can't tell what a repository is, can't tell it's a data set. And that's why we added the bracketed description. So the copy editors and folks downstream in production don't clobber it. And they have to know what it is and tag what it is because the XML going to Crossref has to be specific for a data set, specific for software, different than a journal citation. And if it's not specific, it's not going to make it. So you by identifying it, it's much better. But you almost don't have to do that for a complex citation object because you know what it is and the metadata says what it is. So I just argued a circle.
I'll take a look at this recommendation. Yeah, it's
Okay.
an interesting challenge because it ideally the identifiers within the complex object will point to additional metadata, as Ted was describing, that will provide more context and perhaps a type. So whether it's there or not, it should be accessible. But
And you should get your types right. Like you should pay attention that the types are right at your repository. And this is actually Natalie Ray is on. She's got other research on reference managers on how the types aren't necessarily right. So there's a whole behind the scenes to make sure it's correct.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Shelley. Not seeing more in the chat. I think how about we call the session there? So thanks to everyone, Ted, Madison, and Shelley in particular, all of you who contributed to the discussion in the chat. Lots of really good stuff. I hope you got good pointers and good information. I know I certainly have lots of stuff to look into now, which is both great and daunting as the space continues to expand. But it's great to see the progress being made. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks to ESIP for hosting, and I'm sure there's another session soon, right? And I won't even say what time it is. Look at your schedule, go to the next session. See you all later in the meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.